So it's really nice to come and speak to you. I'm going to be talking about a variety of things today. I'm going to start off with a little bit of a pitch about what I do and some of the things that we've got working in this part of the world. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about research and how SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 pandemic changed a lot of what we do and how it's going to change in the future for the next pandemic, which actually might be happening now, but we're not yet quite sure. I'm not going to talk too much about monkeypox. Has anybody had monkeypox yet? No? Anybody's not seen it yet? We've had a few cases in Manchester. I think from what I understand, it's worth missing. It probably won't kill you, but it's a very unpleasant experience. So, you are aware there's been a pandemic, aren't you? It's been fairly miserable for all of us. But I'm going to actually try and suggest that there are some real positives that have come out of it. And that certainly from a science point of view and from a medicine point of view, we're now much better placed to deal with future pandemics than we ever were. And I'm also going to try and persuade you that in the UK, we were actually much better prepared for this than the rest of the world. And we have led the rest of the world in terms of treatments and research in COVID-19. And all the hospitals in the UK have been involved in that. So the Chester Hospital was involved, we were involved. It's been fantastic. I'll try and persuade you that that's the case. So a little bit about me. I do work at the Manchester Royal Infirmary here. I also work at the Children's Hospital in Manchester. I work in emergency medicine, which, as you know, at the moment is under a little bit of stress. Things are pretty tough on the ground. You may read about it in the papers. It's all true. It's never been this bad. We regularly come on now to 180 people in the department and people waiting 12 to 16 hours to be seen and waiting 1 to 2 days to get a bed. This needs to change. Enough of the politics. Things are tough. But actually, it's still a great place to work. We do really, really interesting medicine. And central Manchester has a population which never ceases to surprise me of new and interesting ways to injure themselves or to take new forms of drugs. Their interest in pharmacology is really quite remarkable. On a Saturday night, they could all get a job in pharmacy. Other things that we do, and this is my pitch for today, is I don't know whether you know this, but we talked about the air ambulance, so I'm working with the air ambulance now, which is a lot of fun. There we go. There's our helicopter on top of the Royal Manchester, on top of the Oxford Road site in central Manchester, and that's a really, really good place to work. Really great fun. But the air ambulance, I don't know whether you know, it runs 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And outside of those times, there are only volunteer doctors who work in pre-hospital care. And that's a scheme which exists around here, which is this organisation. You might see this car knocking around in Chester on a Friday or a Saturday night. And this is a group of volunteers, paramedics and doctors who go out and support the ambulance service for cardiac arrests, for major trauma and for the severe cases like that. And if you want to know more about that, I'm going to leave a link with some information up at the end of the lecture. And I'd really like you to come and have a visit, look at the website. And if you want any questions about that, please ask me. And outside, we've got the Land Rover, which is all kitted up with all the kit that we would take to the scene of an accident. If anybody wants to see that, the defibrillators, the airway kit and stuff like that, we can have a play outside. And also, the black Land Rover there is covertly covered in blue lights and sirens. I might show you where the secret button is to turn the lights on, because that's, I still like that, because that's what I like doing. Right, enough of that. Do you remember 2020 and the parties at the end of 2020? And it was really quite a nice time. People were still going out. People were having Christmas parties and New Year's parties. And there were some inklings, weren't there, about something happening in China in December of that year. And as we now know, that something was really quite significant. COVID-19 changed the world in many ways. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story of COVID-19. But it was around about that time when we started to hear things. And I remember having a conversation with my wife, who's an ophthalmologist, and we heard 2 pieces of information in early January which changed our view of what was going to happen. The first was they decided you could have asymptomatic transmission. So you could have somebody who's got the disease, they can give it to someone else, and they wouldn't know they've got it. And the second thing we found out is that the R number was greater than 1. So for each person, they would infect more than one other person. And as soon as you had those 2 pieces of information, if you ever hear that again in the future, you have a pandemic. Unless everybody stops traveling, and that was never going to happen. It just doesn't work in the modern world. And now we know that the impact of it is absolutely immense. These are actually old numbers. I think we're well into the sort of 400-500 million cases now. Huge number of deaths worldwide. Very difficult to calculate the number of deaths. A friend of mine works in Geneva for the World Health Organization, and actually how many people died in COVID-19 is actually really difficult to work out, because a lot of countries around the world don't have particularly good tracking mechanisms for working out who's died and who's not. And of course, there's a load of other things that happened as well. So the survival rate for things like out-of-hospital cardiac arrest plummeted because everybody stopped doing CPR. People stopped helping out at accidents and stopped helping people on the street all over the world. That had a big impact. Cancer care was affected, surgery stopped, lots and lots of other things happened. So it's been absolutely dramatic what happened to us. But what I'm going to talk about today is how it affected research and how it changed the way that we do things and how it's going to change the future of what we do. Because some of the decisions that we made were really quite interesting. Now, you may have come across this phrase, which is evidence-based medicine. It's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to practice medicine on the basis of high-quality research and literature. Actually, that's a lie. Most of the time, we just do what we did last week, and we don't really think about it too much, or we do what the boss says, or we do what was in the textbook. But we're supposed to practice on the best available evidence from high-quality clinical trials. That is the idea behind the movement, which is evidence-based medicine. We spend a lot of time doing this. We spend a lot of time sharing information, having journal clubs, trying to teach the juniors, trying to bring people up to speed and doing the best we can. And that's been an ethos now for probably about 25 years. But actually, if you dig into it about what actually people do, the decisions that they make, is not based on what the latest trial in the Lancet or the British Medical Journal says. Because most people don't read every single word of those journals every single week. There are something like 20,000 medical journals worldwide. Just in my specialty, there's probably, people estimate something like between 3,000 and 4,000 journals relevant to what I do. I don't read them. I don't know anybody who does. And most of it's rubbish, actually. It genuinely is. Most of it is terrible. So the decisions that you make as a doctor or as a clinician are based not necessarily just on the evidence-based medicine, the literature, but it is partly on the evidence. It's sometimes what you believe in. So the person who makes a decision about what clinical care you get in practice, their opinions about what they think works with people who they've seen like you before really matters. Your GP wouldn't give the same treatment to every single person in this room because they might have different views about you, or they might have different views about that particular type of evidence. I don't really believe it. It's not quite right. And you may find that disturbing, but this is how doctors actually work. And the third bit is the media. You know, how do people find that information, and how influenced are they by the press, the lay press, the medical press, scientific press, but also what now comes through things like social media feeds, what they get on their phone in the morning. And we know, and this will be another talk by somebody much cleverer than me, that the news feed that you get is different to the one that I get, because Facebook and Google have the algorithms that point the information that it thinks I want to listen to in my direction. And medical journals and medical research is now using those same techniques to target people around the world. It's very interesting. Scary, absolutely terrifying, but it's true. So EBM to me is about the belief systems. We as individuals, both patients and doctors, are really important in what actually happens. So I used to go around and I used to ask people, how do you think you like your evidence? So how are you going to make a decision in clinical practice? How do you want it to be? And you would like, I'm guessing, your clinicians to make their decisions on high-quality evidence, which has been around for a long period of time, which is built on previous learning, which is built on previous expertise, and is really sound, wouldn't you? Well, to some extent, that's probably true. So certainly if you've got cardiac disease, that's probably true. The trials are out there. There's been lots of money put into it. And the evidence is pretty good for most things that we do, say, in cardiac disease. It's not so good in some other things, particularly women's health and mental health, but it's not bad. But then you get a pandemic that comes along, which is a disease which nobody's ever seen before, that we've never experienced. There's nobody alive, really, who's clinically practicing who remembers the last major significant pandemic back in 1912, although we have had pandemics since. So how would you like your evidence now? People are dying. the hospital mortality, so you arrive in hospital with COVID and you need to be admitted, 1 in 3 people died in the initial phase. Society's been blown out. Would you like to wait for your evidence to be progressive, methodical, balanced, maybe take a little bit of time to get it? And on average, it takes between 12 and 17 years for high-quality evidence to be published to then appear at the bedside. It's a really slow train to get through. I can give you loads of examples of that. Even really cheap drugs that are well-known can take 12 years to get into practice. But now you've got a pandemic which is killing millions of people. So do you want it now? Well, you do, don't you? So you've got a problem, because that's not how research works. Research traditionally takes a long period of time. It takes a whole lifetime to sort of develop an area of practice. So what did we know about COVID-19 in January 2020? Nothing, really. We didn't know how to treat it. We didn't know which drugs worked. We didn't know which drugs might be harmful. So philosophically, as clinicians, what we had to do is decide what to do. Because there's some really good ideas. There's some loads of drugs out there, some of which you might recognize on here. The people said, well, these are really good drugs that could work in COVID-19. So take the top one, hydroxychloroquine, which is probably the one that was most talked about in the general media. Hydroxychloroquine's got antiviral properties. And it's used for lots of things. It's not that hard. Just occasionally it causes your heart to stop. But apart from that, it's not massive in terms of very occasionally. But it does have side effects. But people are dying. So we should just give this to people, shouldn't we? And give it a try. And then lopinavir, ritonavir is a well-known drug which is used in HIV. Perhaps less so now, but it's a well-tried and tested drug that's out there. And a whole bunch of other stuff that we could use. None of which we knew whether they worked or not. And this is a key point where the UK differed from the rest of the world. Because in the rest of the world, particularly if you go to places, initially there were big numbers of this going on in China or Hong Kong, and then in the US, people felt they had a right to take drugs if they wanted to. So basically, they bought them, they went to their doctor, they got them prescribed by their doctor, they had the drugs. In the UK, and this is where it gets a little bit political about whether you want to have what some people call a nanny state or a free-for-all, we said, you're not getting any drugs unless you're part of a trial. So you come into hospital with your COVID-19, you would get supportive therapy, you get fluids, you get antibiotics, which we were given back then, don't know why. We gave oxygen, and we supported that person through their illness. But if you wanted to go onto any of the drugs, they were only available within the confines of a clinical trial, which meant that we started the research from a structured approach as opposed to the rest of the world where it became very random. So massive differences. And of course, pretty much the rest of the research stopped around the world. It's a whole bunch of stuff. So look, this is back in 2021. The peak there, if you can't read the numbers from the back, is we were at one point registering 130 different trials a week. These are high, reasonably good quality trials. Well, actually, no, they weren't. There was a lot of trials being registered. Huge numbers of trials being registered around COVID-19 all the way through that year. So there's a big explosion of research around the world, but there was also the American version, which is everybody needs to take hydroxychloroquine. Do you remember Trump talking about hydroxychloroquine? What harm can it do? Yeah, well, it kills people. Cut to the chase, read the papers, it kills people. It certainly doesn't help them in COVID-19. Lots and lots of trials going through, so lots and lots of activity heading on with those sort of things. But there's a real problem in that what we were seeing is a vast number of trials were actually very small. So if you look on here, it tells you the number of studies with the size of the trial. So obviously, the bigger the trial, the more likely you are to get an accurate result. But there's a huge number of trials there. The peak is about 100 people in a trial. And unless the treatment effect is absolutely enormous, you'll get nothing out of a trial of 100 people. And why are we doing trials of 100 people for a disease which is infecting 400 million people worldwide? And again, this wasn't allowed to happen in the UK because we've got a fairly good research structure and organisation and oversight, we didn't allow these things to happen unless they were truly, just early experimental trials with small numbers. What we did do is create large trials which could actually answer questions. The other thing we saw is a duplication of trials. So again, you probably won't be able to see this, but what it essentially does say is that there were an enormous number of trials of certain drugs. So things like hydroxychloroquine, because it was particularly controversial, attracted more funding, which made more trials.
Could you read the legends?
Yes. So on the left-hand side, you've got... Do you want me to go back to the other one? Just this one. So the left is the number of trials, cumulative on the left-hand side, on the y-axis. On the bottom is the registration date. So if you take the top blue line, which is hydroxychloroquine, what you're seeing there is not a lot happened until about April. And then hydroxychloroquine became very controversial, largely in the press. So it's how the media was driving the research agenda. This is international, not UK. And all of a sudden, you saw this massive explosion of hydroxychloroquine. Ivermectin, which is the green one there, ivermectin, which is the anti-worm medicine that we give to sheep and Americans, that had quite an explosion again because it became very popular in the press. And in the UK, ivermectin wasn't studied particularly extensively, although there are some early trials being looked at for outpatient management using ivermectin. So in the UK, we didn't say no to anything, but we were selective about what we were going to research, and we designed the trials of sufficient size and complexity that they would actually give us an answer which would be helpful. But you're right, they are a bit small on here, so I will do remind me to do that again. So the analogy I like is this one, which is that before COVID-19, clinicians like me wanted our evidence a bit like going to a Michelin-starred restaurant. You'd want to know who made it, how good it was, where the ingredients came from, and how it was put together. And then post-COVID, essentially, it was like turning out of a nightclub at 2 o'clock in the morning and finding a kebab shop, in that you'd just basically consume anything. Because people were just saying, oh, there's this trial from China of 60 people and 60 people, and it says that hydroxychloroquine works. Right, let's give 200 million people hydroxychloroquine. Whereas if you tried to do that sort of research before COVID, people would just laugh and go, this is tiny, this is just rubbish. Why are you even paying it any attention? So philosophically, the bar of what people would accept and what people would act on suddenly changed, and practice suddenly changed as a result. So that's all about thresholds, isn't it? We all have thresholds about when we decide to change something. So when do we decide to change practice? And in medicine, doctors are actually pretty conservative. We know that because of those trials that shows it takes about 12 to 17 years to change practice. Sometimes that's economic. You can't just build a new laboratory or a new theatre or do a new technique. But sometimes even just simple drug changes take a long time for us to do it. But in COVID-19, this phrase kept coming up a lot. What is the harm in just giving this a whirl? It might work. And again, not to sort of shroud wave at you, but when 1 in 3 of the hundreds of patients coming through your department aren't going home, there's a lot of personal and philosophical pressure for just doing something. Because doing nothing feels wrong. Well, there is a risk, and we saw all of this. Firstly, if you just give something a whirl, it might not work, so it might be a completely futile thing to do. It might harm them, and we saw that with a number of the drugs that were tried in the early phases. You actually found more people died with the drug than without. Hydroxychloroquine, for example. It can cost a lot of money, and it can divert you from doing something else. But most importantly, again, it's about behaviours, is that once you start doing something on a regular basis, it's very difficult to stop. And there's a phrase in medicine that it takes 10 times as much research and energy to stop people doing stuff as it does to get them to start doing it at the beginning. It's just the way that people are. And that inertia that happens once you started doing something is a real risk. And it takes those things. But what about your grandmother? Now, they're looking at this audience, there may be grandmothers here. And this was the grandmother test, which again was all set out, was, if it was your granny there in the bed, would you not want her to have the best? Would you not want her to have this? Why could you be so cruel? Well, 2 things. One, you might not like your granny. That's the first thing. You've always got to be worried about that, and she might actually have a really good will. Anyway, there could be a financial gain, but no, not really. The other is, it's all of those things we talked about before. And to some extent is all of those elements of risk that could be. You could actually putting these people at harm, just as an individual, but actually, when we're looking at a pandemic, also as a society. Because we are actually all of this in this together. And if we waste our money and time, we're wasting everything. Brief thing about social media. Did it make a difference? Oh my God, yes. It was all over the shop. This is a blog and podcast that we run. This is the St. Emmeline's blog downloads, just a number of downloads on the left-hand side, and the 3 bars of the podcast, the blog and things. So this is an evidence-based medicine thing that we do in our free time, goes around the world. Massive spike around the initial part of the pandemic, as you would expect. And this was reproduced all across the world with all the people who were working in social media and medicine in that interface saw this doubling or tripling of activity during those times. And I'm sure you will have seen this again, through Facebook and Twitter and other apps like that. Lots and lots of activity and information going, not necessarily of high quality. We also saw something which has never been seen really in medicine before. Now, some of you here might have worked in things like physics or chemistry or engineering, where you have this idea that you do some research. What normally happens then is you send it to a journal, it gets sent out for peer review, somebody has a look at it, says whether it's good or, says it meets the standard, makes some corrections and ideas, comes back, and then the editor may or may not accept it. That's how things get in publication. And that peer review process is universally recognized. It's actually deeply flawed, but that's a talk for another day. Deeply flawed system, but that's how it works. There are checks and balances between the researchers doing the research and it going out for general consumption. We can argue about whether they're good checks and balances, but there are checks and balances. What we saw in COVID is what often happens in things like physics, chemistry, and engineering, is that authors would go onto websites called preprint websites, and they would publish their research before it's been peer-reviewed. Now that's okay, that's happened in physics and chemistry for a long period of time, and the idea there is that people would then go in and you have more of a team peer review. So lots of people can have a look at it, do the comments, help the authors again, and then that subsequently goes to the journal and gets published in a better state. Nothing wrong with that, it's a good system, it's actually better than it works in medicine. What happened in COVID is that the authors would put it onto the preprint server, that would then be picked up by the press would then publish it, it would then go into clinical practice. Now, if that's high quality stuff, great. But it meant that the normal systems of checks and balances were lost. And a lot of papers and a lot of people started practicing on the basis of really a fairly uncontrolled system. So preprint medicine never happened before. We even had science by press release. So the recovery trial, which I'm going to talk about for a few minutes in a second, most of the results of the recovery trial, the best trial in the world ever, were actually released through press release. So just one piece of paper that says, dexamethasone works, use it. Well, where's the paper? Where's the data? Where's the information? Oh, you can have that in about 4 weeks' time. But believe us, it works. Really? Actually, it does, but the point is, the normal processes were just completely taken out. Social media, again, COVID-19 was controversial. It is controversial still. The size of this means that you won't be able to read it, but essentially a lot of these tweets are from people, some of them fairly influential in the world of Twitter and social media, directly attacking the researchers of trials looking at things like hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, dexamethasone, etc. So these now, we've got this idea that the authors are actually becoming almost celebrities in their own right, not sort of footballers type celebrities, obviously, but their names became known, and there were campaigns against these individuals to try and get them to stop doing things, accusing them of doing something, giving them death threats for doing the research. Again, this is a new world which had never been engaged with. Most researchers in medicine are they go into that because they've got slightly introverted personalities, shall we say. Whereas now they were being front and center in the papers, on social media, and accused of stuff. So that's a couple of bad things. What about the good things? How has it actually changed? Well, this is the key bit. This is how we've had this shift in everything that we're going to be doing for the next pandemics. Most trials, if you want to trial a drug, have this very, very basic system. Okay? So you take a body of patients, so you define a group of patients. In this case, let's say patients who are brought into hospital because they've got COVID-19. Okay? So they're sick enough to need to come into hospital, sick enough to need oxygen, and they've got COVID-19. That's the group that we're going to look at. And then we're going to trial 2 drugs, so trial a drug. So you're either going to get the drug or you're not. And we decide who's going to get it by throwing a dice, just randomly assigning them to one group or the other. And then we follow them up and see what happens. That is the basic design of a trial. It's a randomized control trial. It's a good way of doing trials. Problem with it is it takes forever. The amount of red tape involved in this is enormous. So we're designing a randomized control trial now for the air ambulance. And we started thinking about it 2 months ago. I think if we're lucky, we'll probably recruit our first patient around about autumn next year, just because of the hoops that we need to jump through.
Can I just ask a question? Ethics committees?
Yes. Yes.
How did you actually manage the ethics committees in such a, getting stuff through an ethics committee in such a chaotic situation?
So the timeline for it, because people recognise, so this repeat the question. So the question is, how do you get through ethics? So, because we have a national platform, so slightly out of sequence. So we'll talk about this again in a second, but essentially what happened was there was a trial designed for the previous flu pandemic. So we had a bit of a flu pandemic a few years ago, swine flu. So there was a trial put into hibernation at that time, waiting for the next flu pandemic. And I was one of the researchers on that. So we had this trial all designed. It had all been through ethics. Every single hospital in the country was waiting with the documentation, racing to go to do the next flu pandemic. And what they realized when this kicked off is, hang on a minute, this looks a bit similar. We can learn from this. And so they did a very accelerated ethics committee approval. So it all happened in a week, what would normally take 6 to 9 months. And because it was done at national level, and everybody in the room recognized that this had to be done and had to be done quickly. And I think I've got the slide of the timelines, it's on one of the presentations, but the time from recovery coming in, the recovery trial being designed and going through ethics, to the first result coming out was something like 12 weeks, which is unheard of. But yeah, so what recovery is. So what we did in the UK is instead of doing that randomized control trial thing, so like every single drug you'd have to do this for, and there's lots and lots of activity going on, instead of doing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of small trials, they put in what's called a platform adaptive trial. And this is the key difference. So in a platform adaptive trial, sort of answers your question again, is what we do is we take that group of patients, okay, and we say, this is the group of patients we're going to study, and what's important to us, the outcomes, are survival at 28 days as it happens. So we've got a beginning and we've got an end. What we do in the middle, we can change. So we're just going to keep running the trial, people at the beginning, results at the end, but we'll test, right, drug number 1, what we're going to test. Dexamethasone, right. Dexamethasone, right. Got an answer, right, okay. Keep the trial going, just put another drug in. That one's answered. Keep the trial going, put another one in. So you're not having to go back to the beginning and do the ethics and do the research design and all that kind of thing every time. The trial runs, but the interventions change. It's really obvious, isn't it? So this was the original sort of trial design. So you go in, eligible patients on the left, they get randomized. So just this is a computer that decides whether you get it or you don't. In this case, you either got azithromycin, which is an antibiotic, it didn't work, or not. And then we follow you up. And the other thing in the adaptive trial is you can then, what we were also able to do is to identify a group of patients who had very severe disease, the ones in intensive care. And for those patients, we also offered some really high, much more risky medications. So for the people just coming in, for the people who really were on death's door, where the risk-benefit of some of the medications and the side effects was greater, we offered a second randomization into some of the very significantly, particularly the drugs which really lower your immune response. So you could have more than one randomization, more than one drug, over more than one period of time, but the whole model just runs and keeps running, and you don't have to go back to the beginning every time you get a result. So yeah, it changed. We put in things like plasma, and then at the moment, the trial looks a little bit like this. So there are 5 arms. There's 3 antivirals. There's one enoxagliptin, is it? Which is one of the diabetes medications, and high-dose steroids. So high-dose steroids if you're on intensive care versus low-dose steroids. And then the other 4 are randomized for people coming into hospital. So that's what it looks like this week. If we get a result for one of these next week, that will go out. Something else may come in. Although it probably won't because we're closing the trial later this year. So that was recovery. It's looked at a load of different drugs. So just in the time that we've been running through the COVID-19, we've done randomized control trials of up to 30,000 patients in each of these arms for all of these drugs. And we now know that 4 of them significantly reduce your mortality. We now know that a whole bunch of the other ones do not. And we're still researching the 4 at the bottom. The 4 at the bottom are interesting. I can't even pronounce it. The anti-diabetes drug at the top. That's not quite sure about that one. Sotrovimab is an antibody which has been designed off a patient who recovered from COVID-19. So they've copied the code for it. Now they can produce that antibody and then use that as a drug. I mean, that is straight out of science fiction, in my opinion. Molnupiravir and Paxlovid are also antiviral drugs, or have antiviral properties. So, has this made a difference? Amazing. Well, it's actually amazing if you look at the numbers. So this is the dexamethasone one. This is the first drug that was identified as being a significant decrease of mortality amongst hospitalized patients. And for those requiring oxygen, the numbers are just incredible. This is data now, I think, is probably going to be around about 1.5 million and about 30,000 in the UK of people who are now alive who we would have expected to die based on just on the treatments of dexamethasone. Now, that's never happened since penicillin. Since the introduction of antibiotics, there has never been anything else that has had that much effect on that many people in such a short period of time. And I'm not sure that we really recognize that. It was, and numbers-wise, you just keep going on it. Convalescent plasma, so that's taking plasma from people who've had COVID and then giving it to people who've got COVID, because it's hopefully got the antibodies in. That didn't work, but it was given to over 500,000 people in the US who were then exposed to a blood transfusion, effectively. Lots of harm, lots of costs, lots of waste, because in the US, they didn't do the trials. I'm not sure what the numbers are now. I think it's close to 90,000 in the study. Oh yeah, here's a timeline. Now, this is too small. We wanted a bigger screen for this, but I'll just read out the 2 bits that are interesting. So the 5th of March, there was funding offered for a trial. Okay, 5th of March. First protocol went to ethics on the 13th of March, 8 days later. By the 14th of May, 10,000 patients have been randomized. And on the 16th of June, so that's 3 months later, they announced that dexamethasone reduced mortality by 1/3. That's bonkers. We'll never see, unless we have another pandemic, we'll never see that again. We are having another pandemic. You know about monkeypox. From my point of view, what I see coming through the department now, because we're still seeing people with COVID, there's 3 groups of people now we see with COVID. Anti-vaxxers who've not had the medication. There you go, good luck to you. People who've not had a response. Unfortunately, vaccines don't work for everybody. That's okay. And that's just sad, that's just unlucky. We'll treat everybody the same. And the 3rd group are those who've got immunosuppressed, particularly patients, so things like if they've got renal impairment or cancer patients or stuff like that. So those are the 3 groups we're seeing now. So we're still seeing them, not in big numbers. Mortality, if you came in with a COVID pneumonitis in the first wave, was 1 in 3 died. Now that mortality is 16%. You think of any disease that's happened to. It's just amazing. But we're not over yet. These are the latest graphs, came out last week, of the Omicron, what are we on now, 4, 5. Numbers are going up. But even though the numbers are going up and the infections are going up, that blue line at the top there is the UK infection rate. What we're not seeing is the big peaks in hospital attendance because there's still quite a lot of residual immunity in the community. So if you've still got a few antibodies knocking around, you're not then getting the severe inflammatory disease which leads to you ending up in hospital. So vaccination seems to have done a lot. Right, nearly at the end. Coming to the future. What does the future hold? Flu. Always amuses me that people say, you know, the COVID pandemic was just like the 1912 one, the flu pandemic. It's not. It's a completely and utterly different virus. We are still overdue the next flu pandemic. So the 1912 Spanish flu should be happening now. That's what we're expecting. Very, very shortly, we should have another massive flu pandemic. So we're going to do it all again. But it'll be worse, because flu is a nastier illness than COVID. When you get a big antigenic shift, it's a horrible disease. So we talked about what I was talking about before. The ASAP study was this hibernating study. So you set up a whole trial, and then you put it on pause, poised to go. So ASAP trial is in all the trials across a load of hospitals across the UK. I'm the principal investigator for it in Manchester. This is actually now going to change, and what we're going to turn ASAP into is going to be the recovery trial is going to go into hibernation, or something similar to the recovery trial. So when the next pandemic hits, we'll be even further ahead on that time scale that I showed a few moments ago than we were this time. But we were so far ahead of the rest of the world. Because we had a flu pandemic, and we were bright enough, because we've got the National Institute of Healthcare Research, NIHR, we've got these national, you go to America, and places that you would expect to be able to do this sort of thing. But they're in these very separate sort of organisations. They don't communicate in the same way that we do. So research has always been pretty collaborative in the UK. So they set up these national programs. We have a national funding thing. Say, here's a national trial. You can apply to be part of the national trial. So here's 200 hospitals. We're all ready to go. Now, just the economics, the health economy doesn't work like that in the USA. In Australia and New Zealand, ANZIC's groups have, ANZA groups, they have a very similar system for critical care trials down there. They really lead the critical care trials around the intensive care trials around the world. They've got a fantastic system. They just didn't do it. This one caught them not unawares, but they were just not on the same scheme that we were on. They'd done fantastic stuff in sepsis. That was their real thing. They'd done a lot of the big sepsis trials, but they'd missed the potential for the infectious diseases one. So we were ready, and other places weren't. And we have the national structure that we can do it. And because we're a national health service, we can go in and say, you're not getting the drug unless you're part of the trial. That's philosophical, it's political, that's autonomy and all that kind of thing, ethics. I'm not qualified to talk about those sort of things, but it's a difficult one. I know where I stand, but I know other people have different views, and they can have those. So evidence-based medicine has turned into evidence-based agility. What we've shown is that by being agile, by being adaptable, we can actually make a massive difference. So, to answer my own question, did SARS-CoV-2 kill evidence-based medicine? And the answer is, it didn't kill it, severely wounded it at the beginning. People were way off using evidence. They were using their belief systems, they were using Twitter, they were using the media, they were moving what sounded like a good idea. And as a result, things didn't go very well for a while. But as many sort of challenges in life happen, once they get stressed, they get fitter, they get stronger. And we're now in a much better place than we were before we started for the next pandemic. Although I really hope it doesn't happen, because it's going to be grim if it does. So, SARS-CoV-2 is a balance. Undoubtedly one of the worst things that's ever happened in medicine in our lifetimes. But on the other side of the balance, we've learnt a huge amount. And for the next time, we're in a better situation. So, thank you very much for your time.
Am I on?
So we're going to do questions, I think.
Yep. Any questions? If you'd like to put your hand up, I will bring the microphone to you. Christine, here we go. Yes, please don't tell us about any of your personal experiences that you are not happy to be on YouTube forever.
Right, the first is an observation. I took a shortcut through Boots to get here this morning, and they've put a whole corner for vaccinations for the flu. So there's obviously work going on there, and we all need to take that up. And the other one is not directly related to what you've been talking about, but it's a sort of bugbear of mine. Why do we not use our NHS number across the NHS? It's worked very well for the vaccination programme, but the hospital has one number, your GP has another number, and it just seems counterproductive to me, because when I worked in hospitals, I would see people with common names often in multiple times.
Yeah, so the answer, I don't know, but it is being increasingly used. So if I want to use a regional service now, so if I need to phone up neurosurgery or spinal surgery or burns plastics, which are in another hospital, they're not interested in district numbers. They go off the NHS number. And things like the radiology systems now. Radiology is one of the few IT systems which works incredibly well in the NHS. That runs off NHS numbers. So I think it's coming. As more and more hospitals go on to electronic patient records, I think the NHS number will be much more important. We're about to go on to it. So we're the second biggest trust in the UK, I think, now. And we're just going on to an electronic patient record later this year. Tried to take holiday for that week, but I'm not allowed.
Okay,
So, I think it will get better.
We have a question from upstairs. If you say it, I'll repeat it.
You'll probably hear me. Simon, if you read Debbie Schiller, then she says that we're very lucky in the openness, the accidental openness of the initial Chinese discovery. You've been talking about something different, not vaccine development, but does openness, is that an issue for you around the world, in that not everything is revealed?
Is openness an issue around the world?
I mean, the simple answer is yes, isn't it? I mean, the more open and collaborative we can be, the better. You are right, there was a degree of openness, certainly from the scientists in China and other countries around the world.
I read the evidence, the Chinese tried to suppress it, but it did get up because of the decency of some of the Chinese scientists.
Yeah.
Raised it.
And I think those stories probably exist in our countries as well. There will be people who've done things and pushed things along when there was and is always a conflict between managing the public health and managing the economy. And I think some of the decisions which were made and we saw in practice were good examples of experts advise, politicians decide. And sometimes, there's good rumour, isn't there, that sometimes the experts' advice was not followed. And sometimes those experts manage to get that information out via other means. And so there is a lot of politicking that goes on in these sort of things. We are kind of all trying to do the right sort of thing, but we do have different perspectives. So I think you're right. Certainly getting the early sequencing about what was going on was very important. And some of those people allegedly, I don't know the full details, but some of the people who did do leaks in other countries didn't come out of it very well on a personal level, did they?
Next question.
This is not particularly about COVID, it's particularly about the social media. I've read numerous articles on social media from so-called renowned medical people. For example, there's a person who calls himself a renowned professor of medicine in a renowned Swiss hospital, and he's rubbishing our treatment of enlarged prostates. He said, listen to my tale. It's a long video. It's about 20 minutes long, this video. And of course, he's going to sell something. You can say he's going to sell you something. How do we judge whether to believe in these articles from so-called experts in this subject?
So it's a good question. So how can I answer this one? The first is you look for their reflected credentials, by which I mean not just who are they and who do they say they are, but who are they linked to and what organisations do they work with. So if you want to get into this, one of the interesting things is you can look at the way Google algorithms work for your money or your life issues. So we've got this website which runs for St Emlyn's, an evidence-based medicine website. So we are one of those self-styled experts who give out information on medical practice. So Google looks at us in a different way than the tea shop down the road. And what it does is it looks at who we are and it looks at how we link out to other organisations. So it'll look for who I am and then it'll try and find me. Am I actually on a university website? Yes. Okay, fine. Did I actually speak at a conference where other people who were also at university websites? And what sort of university was that? And how was it credentialed? And do they have a PhD? And where was that PhD from? So Google is doing all of this thing in the background. So some of it's happening there. Some of it you might be getting stuff which is dodgy because of once you've looked. So input the name. But what I'm getting at is Google is doing that automatically. But what you should be doing if you're thinking about your money or your life is you find someone, you probably need to go and do a little bit of background checking and see where they are. Have they published? Where have they published? Has that been, valued? That kind of thing. That's a little bit laborious, but that is the answer. You have to do your own background checking, not of the information, but of who they are. But then, there are people out there who think that because they're linked to a university and they've got a PhD, that means they're part of the collective massive of people who are trying to rule the world, and they're all aliens. So it's difficult. It's difficult. But yeah, check out their backgrounds. Look for credibility. And there are credibility scores out there that you can look for individuals. You can go onto the research websites. They're free and open access, and you can find out where people are. There are ranking systems for people in research. So go to Google Scholar, and you can look on there. You can look at the individual, and you can look at what's called their H index, about how they've published, where they've published, what the quality of their publication is.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Dave Atkinson. You were talking about, was it adaptive trial platforms? Is that the right terminology?
Yeah.
Okay. Did that include testing combinations of drugs?
Yes.
Because that must have been capable of producing an infinite number of cocktails. And how was that dealt with? Because that's a hugely time-consuming separate bit of it, isn't it?
It is. So in rough terms, it makes the maths a little bit more complicated. If you get randomized for two different groups, so we're doing A and B, so we're looking at A and B, whether A is better than B, but you're also getting randomized to C and D. What will happen is roughly half of these groups in these two down here will also be randomized to A and B. So what happens effectively is because this is randomized here and because it's randomized here, the fact that some people are on one or other of these ones gets cancelled out. Once it gets more than two combinations, it gets complicated. If you had a very strong treatment effect, it should still, because you're just randomizing both groups, you'd expect in the group getting A, you'd expect half of them to have C and half of them to have D. In the group getting B, you'd expect half of them to have C, half of them to have D. So it should cancel itself out. That's the theory. It only really works if you're starting putting through big numbers. If you're looking at small numbers, you can get that could make a bigger impact on your results. But when you're talking about, as we are in these trials, 20 to 30,000 people in each of the comparisons, it should cancel itself out. That's the theory behind randomization.
Presumably some of these combinations will have form anyway, which will be known from previous use.
Yeah, but this is a new disease. So what would happen? So what did happen with, say, dexamethasone is once we decided dexamethasone works, everybody then gets dexamethasone. So that is then censored. You can then do a subgroup analysis of the people after that event just to make sure that that effect hasn't disappeared. So there are checks and balances within the system, but randomization itself should solve the problem, with the emphasis on should, because you never quite know.
Any more questions? Here we go.
Oh, thanks for an excellent talk. I was very impressed by your description of the strength of the NHS in organising nationwide trials, can I say world-beating. And we hear nothing of this in the present political debates about the NHS. Can you suggest why? All we hear about is money made on protective clothing.
I don't know.
We're not allowed to discuss politics at the u3a. But I'd like to.
It's really tricky. There are things that the NHS does exceptionally well, and I think this is really one of them, to be honest. There are things that we don't do well. And at the moment, the problem is every little bit of the system is just under a lot of strain at the moment, and it's multifactorial why. There is no one reason. There's no one bit that's at fault. It's just a combination of factors just to line up. You know, you've come across the concept of marginal gains. The marginal gains? Yeah, well, this is marginal fails. So all these little marginal fails are adding up into a big problem at the moment.
Can I add a personal observation to that? My brother is a paramedic. He's been a paramedic for 30-something years, and he told me that for the first time 2 weeks ago, he spent an entire 12-hour shift sitting in a queue outside A&E. Yeah, words fail me. Yes.
Doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. But that's the first time in 30-odd years.
Yeah, it's the worst it's ever been.
Yeah.
So we used to say in my department that if we had more than 100 people in the department, we'd lost control. We didn't know what was going on because there's just too many moving parts. If the department now goes below 100 people in the department, we have a party. It is literally that bad. It's and people on the corridors. We've now got in some hospitals people putting tape out on the floor, putting a trolley on it, putting a cubicle down the corridors. Not far from here. It's a tricky day. It's a tricky time.
We have time for one last question. Anybody got one? No? Then I will hand back to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. I suppose it's being so cheerful that keeps you going, is it? Well, thank you for that fascinating talk about the second level of medicine, how it's organized, how it's researched, how information is shared, and how Google maybe is trying to tell us about snake oil salesmen that you referred to. But I suppose what we need to do is to teach children how to look for evidence in schools. Really. So thank you to you again for all the time you spent coming here. And thank you to your parents for having had you sitting in the front.
Very good.
Okay.
That was a presentation for Chester U3a. If you enjoyed this talk and want to see some more, please recommend us to your friends. They can take a look at what we have to offer at tasteof.chesteru3a.org.uk. That's tasteof.chesteru3a.org.uk. Thank you.